Welcome to part 6 and the final part of this stylized forest meadow blender tutorial series. If you haven't seen the previous parts, then definitely check out the tutorial playlist, link to that is in the description. So in this part we're going to be animating the camera moving through the scene, and we'll do a few render settings and render out all of the images to frames, and then we'll use Blender's video editor to join it together into a final video and add the music and sound effects. And if you're interested in purchasing the project files, you can find that on my Gumroad store and Patreon page with the links in the description, and that's a great way to help support this channel. And if you'd like to help support the channel here on YouTube, you can check out the YouTube memberships by clicking on that join button down there by the subscribe button. And if you've been enjoying this tutorial series and you'd like to send me a little tip, you can also use the super thanks feature here on YouTube, and I do appreciate all of your support. And then just one more thing before we continue, I wanted to let you know about a really great Blender add-on for easy, quick texture baking. Auto Bake is a really great Blender add-on for easy texture baking. Select the object that you want to bake, and then you can add any of the texture maps in the bake list. You can then change many of the settings like the name of the texture resolution, and where you want the add-on to export the textures. Then just hit the Auto Bake button, and the add-on will automatically texture bake all the textures and save them as files on your computer. You can find my full add-on review video with the link in the description, and if you purchase the add-on through my affiliate link, you'll be helping to support this channel. Alright, so I'm going to start by creating a little bit of fog or mist in the 3D scene, because if we add some fog and mist, then things in the background will just look a little bit faded and a little bit foggy, and it'll kind of add a nice atmospheric effect. So I'm going to go back here to the solid view, and I'll press Shift A for the add menu. Let's go to mesh, and I'm going to add a cube, and I'll hit tab to go into edit mode, and I'm going to scale the cube up really big, and I want to fit the cube to the size of the entire scene. So bring it up on the Z axis, bring it out on the Y axis, and just make it fill the entire scene. You can make it really quite large, just so that there's going to be a bit of fog or kind of a nice atmospheric effect to the scene. So something like that is pretty good. All right, and then what I can do is just click here on the cube, and I can drag and drop it into the scene here so that it's in the main scene. And if I double click on it to rename it, I could just rename it to like fog or atmosphere or whatever you want to call it. So now let's create a basic material for this. So I'm going to go over here to the shading workspace, and I'll click on new to add new material, and I can just rename it to fog. So I'm not going to use the principled shader, so I'll select it and press X to delete it. Let's press Shift A for the add menu, and I'm going to search for volume, and we're going to add the principled volume. Let's drop it here, and because it is a volume, instead of it going into the surface, we want to put it into the volume of the shader. And then I'll hold down the Z button and move my mouse up into the rendered view so you can see what it's looking like. And so if I zoom in here, you can see it's actually really thick right now. So there's basically like a bunch of fog in the scene. So I can turn this density value way down. I can turn it to a very small number, like a 0.01, and you can now see it just looks like there's a little bit of fog in the scene. Now, I don't really want to make it look like fog. I just want to make it look kind of like atmosphere and kind of make the stuff which is farther in the background kind of slightly blue and just slightly faded. So I'm going to turn this density value to a very small number of 0.002, so it is quite subtle. And then also this color here, I'm going to make it a blue color. And the exact same color that I'll be using, if you click here on the color and go to the hex value, you can punch in 3686FF. So it is very subtle. If I go into the camera view though, you can kind of see if I zoom way in, let me just make this smaller. If you zoom way into the background, you can kind of see the background just looks a little bit hazy. If I press the H key to hide the object, here it is before, things look really crisp and sharp. If I press Alt H to unhide the object, just things which are farther away in the background just look slightly atmospheric, and it just adds a nice touch to the 3D scene. So let's click back over here on the layout, and we're now going to be animating the camera. So I'll press the 0 on the numpad to go into the camera, and I can just click on the camera here to select it. And here on the timeline, I'm going to scrub the playhead over to frame 0. And I now want to add a keyframe at this location. So what I'm going to do is press the K button. And again, the K button was a new shortcut key added to Blender version 4.1. So if you're using an older version of Blender, you're going to press the I key instead. But in Blender version 4.1, you'll press K to bring up this menu. And I'm going to insert location, rotation, and scale. Now what I'm going to do, now that I've added location, rotation, and scale values, is I'm going to turn on this auto key button. So this will automatically add keyframes whenever I make a transform of an object. So now what I can do is scrub my playhead all the way to the very end. You can go a little bit farther than the very end, and I want to move this into the scene. So I will hit G to grab, and then I will double tap the Z key, and I can just bring this farther in, and then hit G and Z, and just bring the camera up, maybe bring it back a little bit. I don't want it to be moving too fast. And you can see now it's added a keyframe right there. So if I press the space bar to play this, you can see the camera is just slowly moving through the scene. And you can also see the butterfly flies by. Now I do think the butterfly is a little bit close to the camera. So what I can do is just select this object here, and I just want to move it over a little bit. So if I drag the playhead over to the keyframe where I have the starting of the empty, I can press the period on the numpad to zoom into the empty here, and I want to just move the empty back a little bit. So I'll hit G to grab, and I can drag it kind of over to about here, so it's a little bit farther back, and that is going to override the keyframe. And that's because we were on the same frame as the keyframe, and we had the auto key turned on, so it overrided the keyframe. So I can now scrub the timeline here over to the next spot, and I also just want to move it over a little bit. So I will hit G to grab, and I can move it back over like that. All right, and also this fog here, you can select the fog and just press H to hide it. When you hide objects, they'll still show up in the final render, but you just can't see them in the viewport. So now if I play through this, that's a little bit better. If I go into the camera view, you can see the butterfly is still kind of right there. Let me go into the rendered view so I can see the butterfly. So there's the butterfly, but the butterfly is a little bit farther back. All right, so let's press the space bar to play this again, and I'm going to select the camera. Now a problem is that as the camera gets to the end, it kind of slows down. So I am going to fix that. However, I'm going to fix that after I kind of rotate the camera. So what I want to do is have the camera kind of looking over here, kind of towards the end, and also kind of looking up here, just so that the camera moves around a little bit, so it's kind of looking through the scene. So I'm going to go to around frame 150, and then what I can do is double tap the R key, and then I can hold down the Shift key, and I can just move the camera around. So I might have the camera kind of looking up slightly. I think that might look kind of cool. So now if I play through this, you can see the camera's just looking up a little bit. And then if I have it go right down here, let's maybe go to around 300. I can double tap the R key and then hold down the Shift key to make my movements more sensitive. And I could maybe like bring it down there, something like that. So now you can see the camera just looks around a little bit. So I'm just going to do a simple camera animation. So something like that is pretty good. All right, so that's looking cool. Now you can see here at the end, it kind of slows down. And so I'm going to fix that. So let's open up the graph editor so that we can edit the keyframes. So I'm going to click here when the crosshair appears where my mouse is, and I'm going to click and drag out to split the window. And then I can click here to change the editor type, and we're going to change it to the graph editor. And then let's make these side panels smaller here so we have more space. I'll also make this really small, and I'll bring this in. So make sure you select the camera so you can see the keyframes. And I'm going to hold down the control key and click with my middle mouse wheel to just kind of move this around. So now we can just play this, and you can see this line right here is when the camera kind of looks over and then looks back. And you can also see right up here, there's also this blue line. Now, if you don't know what each keyframe is doing, you can click and drag out here to open up this panel, and this will show you the different translations. So the rotation, location, scale, and it will show you what each one is. So for example, I want to change the location so that it is moving at a more consistent speed. So that's going to be the location values here. So if you click on them, that is going to show them. So you can see if I just zoom way out here, and I need to zoom out really far, you can see here's the X location, here's the Y location, here's the Z location. So what I actually want to do is scale the keyframe handles in so that it moves really fast at the starting. So an easy way to do this is to hold down the control key and then click with my middle mouse wheel, and I'm going to squish everything down so that in the viewport everything is really small. Then I can press the A key to deselect everything, and I can hit B for the box select, and I can just box select these keyframes here at the very end. Then I can scale them, and I will scale them on the X-axis, and I'm going to make them really, really small. And if I wanted to, I could also bring it back, so hit G to grab and bring it back on the X-axis and bring it farther back. Now if I go to the starting and play this, you can see the camera's already moving quite fast, and that is because if I zoom way in here, you can see that I've kind of squished down the handles, whereas if I scaled the handles way out, let me just drag this up like this so you can see it. So you can see if the handles are dragged farther out, then there's going to be this curve here, but if I drag the handles way in, let me just scale them in on the X-axis and make them really small, this curve is going to be much more linear and straight. So instead of it slowing down and then starting to speed up, it'll just immediately be going at a faster speed. So let me just zoom out here, and I'm going to hold down the control key and click with my middle mouse wheel to make it really small. Let's deselect everything, and then I can hit B for the box select, and I'll just box select the keyframes at the end, and I can scale them again on the X-axis and make them really, really small like that. So now if I make this bigger and play this, you can see If I just make this a bit bigger, you can see it's much more straight now. So now if I go to the very end, you can see the camera still is moving, so it doesn't really slow down. You could also move everything back a little bit, so past the end frame if you wanted to. So something like that. And then of course, if you wanted to change the speed of it, you can. So you could scale the keyframes out so that it's moving a bit slower or a bit faster. I just like having a nice slow camera animation, so the camera's kind of just slowly moving through the nature scene. So that is it for the camera animation. I'm just going to go with a very simple animation. So what I can do is just make this a bit smaller. I'll just leave the graph editor right here in case I want to go back to it, because we aren't done with the animation quite yet. Let's press Ctrl S to save. So then the next thing that I want to do is add a depth of field, and we're going to animate the depth of field. So I'll press Shift A for the add menu, and I'm going to add an empty, and I'll just choose the plane axis here. And then I want to rename this object. So if I open up this side panel here, here's the empty, and I can just rename it DOF for depth of field. And then I can drag the depth of field and I can stick it here. I'm actually going to stick it here in the empties because it's in the empties, and I can click on this button here to show the empties. Also the butterfly, I might drag this up here. So the trees, the grass, the flowers, and the plants, those are hidden because they're being distributed on the objects, but I want to see the butterfly, the empty, and the scene. So now that I've renamed it, I'm going to make sure I select it by clicking on the empties and then clicking on the depth of field. Let's hit G to grab and I can move it up here. So what I want to do is snap it to some of the faces. So to do this, I can click on this snapping right here to turn that on. And then if I click here on the settings, I want to change the snap to face. So now if I hit G to grab and move an object around, the object is going to snap to the face. So if I wanted the depth of field to be like really strong or have it really close, I could move it over here, or I can make it farther away, and it's going to snap to the faces. So you can see right here, it's like snapping and it's going along the ground. So I'll just place it here for now. And you can see we've added a keyframe. That's because the auto key was turned on. So I'll just hit X and we're just going to delete the keyframes. So now what I want to do is actually add the depth of field. So if you select the camera, you can click here to go to the object data properties, and we're going to choose depth of field. We'll turn this on. And then on the focus object, we want to click here, and then we just want to select the depth of field object. So I can now drag the f-stop around, and you can see that wherever the distance is of this object here, that is what it's going to focus on, because it's focusing on this object. So I can make it really far away or really close. Now, of course, this depth of field is way too strong, so I'm going to select the camera again, and I like an f-stop value of 1. I think 1 is going to be pretty good. So you can see I can bring this over here, and generally everything is in focus, but things which are really close are just a little bit blurred. So what I'm going to do is actually start the depth of field maybe to about here. And you can see because we had auto key on, it added another keyframe. So what I can do is just press the A key to select the keyframe, and I'll hit G to grab, and I can move the keyframe over here to the starting. So now I can just play through this and we can just change the depth of field. So what I'm going to do is now hit G to grab and just place it right where it is. So you can see now it's not really going to move. So I'm doing that at about frame 120. I could now go to maybe frame 150, and I'll hit G to grab, and I can move the empty up here, maybe move it over to this tree. So now you can see the camera's generally focusing down here, then the camera's kind of focusing up here. I could leave it at the tree for a while, and then I want to bring the focus down here so that it's kind of focusing on these plants as it looks down. So what I can do is just hit G to grab and then just drop it here so it's about at the same spot, and I'm doing that at about 275, and I can now go a little past 300, and I'll hit G to grab, and I can bring this down here and just like bring it down here to the plant. So now the focus is down here by this plant, and I'll go over to about frame 400 and drag it over here. All right, so it's kind of looking at these plants. Then if I go just a little past 400, I'll hit G to grab, and I can drag this way up here to a tree which is really far away. All right, so now if I just play through this, you can see the focus just changes slightly. So as it's looking up here, it kind of looks farther away. And as it's down here, it looks a bit more close up. And I think I actually want these keyframes to happen a bit faster or to happen earlier. So if I deselect everything, I can hit B for the box select, and I can just box select these two keyframes. I'll hit G to grab and move them back a little bit. So now the focus will change a bit quicker or a bit earlier. And then I think I want to change the focus to about here. So when the butterfly is coming into the scene, the focus is closer. So I will box select these keyframes and I will move them back a bit so that the focus will change sooner. All right, there we go. Now the butterfly flies by, and then kind of right here, I think I will box select these and move them back a little bit, just because I think I did everything a little bit late, so that's a little bit better. All right, and that is really going to be it for the animation. So I'll just click on this button here to turn off the auto key so we don't accidentally add keyframes. All right, and also I want to do a quick test render. So if I move my view to right about here where the butterfly is, I'm going to press F12 to render, or you can click on render and choose render image. And the image rendered, that's looking really nice. You can see we have the grass and then the flowers, and then also the butterfly is just a little bit blurred because of the motion blur, so that makes it look more realistic. And we have all the foliage. So I'll hit the escape key to go back here to the 3D view. And then I also want to close the graph editor. So I'll click here when the crosshair appears, drag over, and then let go to close the graph editor. Let's press Ctrl S to save this again. So let's go over some render settings. So I'm just going to minimize these so they're smaller. I can drag this up here. I can also press Alt H. Alt H will unhide that fog. And let's go over some render settings. So of course I'm using Blender Eevee. And here on the sampling, we did this at the beginning of the tutorial. I'm just going to have it at 30 samples in Blender Eevee. Now if you turn the samples way down, I'll just show you what the samples are going to do. So if I turn the samples to 1, I can now render this again. And it did render a bit faster, it only took about 5 seconds. However, if I zoom in here, you can see the edges look kind of crisp and sharp, and there's kind of a lot of pixels, and also the shadows look super sharp, and they're not quite as realistic. So things just don't look quite as nice. You can see even here, there's a little bit of artifacts where there's that motion blur. If I, however, turn this up really big to maybe like 100, I will click on render and render this again. And this time it took a lot longer to render. It took almost 16 seconds. However, if I zoom in here, you can see the shadows are much smoother. There's also like the shadow of the butterfly, and everything looks a bit more smooth and nice. You can see here on the edge of the plant, that looks a lot more smooth. However, this took much longer to render. So I found that for this scene, really, you just need something like a 30. So I'm just going to turn it way down to a 30 here on the render samples. And of course, the motion blur, the screen space reflections, and the ambient occlusion is turned on just to make it look a bit more realistic. Also here on the color management, we did this earlier in the tutorial series, but I'm using filmic and very high contrast. And then if you click here on the output settings, I am going to render this at 2560 by 1440 because I want it to be a nice large 2K resolution image. But of course, you can just use the default of 1920 by 1080, so 1080p. That is very standard, but I'll just be rendering it with 2K. Now we do need to save the images to a folder, and we need to render out all the frames to images, and then we'll use Blender's video editor to compile it together into a video. So right here on the file format, you could totally use the PNG if you want to. Let me just drag this up here so you can see it. So you could totally use PNG if you want to. I'm just going to use JPEG because the file size is smaller, and then the quality here, I'll bump that up to 100 so it keeps the quality. And then right here on the output, we need to choose a folder to save our images. So we'll click right here. And here in the folder with my other files, I'm going to click on this button here to make a new folder. I can just call it frames, and then I can go into the folder and then click on the accept button. So just press Ctrl S again to save the project, and then we will click on render, and we'll click on render animation. And the frames have finished rendering, so you can just open up a completely new Blender file, and then you can go to Blender's video editor, and I have the video editing tab right here, so I'm going to click on the video editing tab. But what you can do if you don't have the video editing tab is click on file, and then click on new, and then open up new video editing. Let's go to the video editor, and then here in the sequencer, I'll press Shift A for the add menu, and let's go to image and sequence. Then you can locate to the folder where you have all the rendered frames, and here in the drop down, make sure that the sort by is set to name so the frames play in the correct order, and click on add image strip. And then also make sure that the frame rate and resolution are the same that you rendered it as in the previous file. So I rendered mine as 2K and the frame rate at 24 frames per second. And then I rendered this at a 500 frame animation, so I'll turn the end frame to 500. So I can press the spacebar to play this, and we can check out the final animation, and you can see there's like the little wind effect and also the wind effect here on the trees. And then also there's the butterfly flying past. So I'll now be adding in the sound effects and music that I went over at part 1 of the tutorial series, and the links will be in the description if you'd like to download the same sound effects and music that I'm using. So I'm first going to be adding in the horse walks in mud on the farm ambience. Drop this in here. Again, this is from freesound.org. Let me drag this a bit bigger, and I can just drag it over here. And I really like the cricket sound, which is right here kind of at the end of the sound. So I can just play this and listen to it. You won't be able to hear the sound effect in the video because I've disabled my computer audio with my screen recording software, but I'll just have this playing through, and I might turn the volume down to like 0.5 so it's not quite as loud. Then I'll also be dragging and dropping in the morning bird sound effect from freesound.org, and I can just drag this around where I want. I like somewhere like that, and I can just have that play through. And then the last thing that I'll be adding in is this childhood music. Again, link is in the description, so I'll just drag and drop this in from my file browser, and then I can just find a spot where I like. I think I'll turn it down to like a 0.3, so turn the volume down, and then I can either have this play at the starting, or I could maybe move it back here and play it right there. And then if you wanted to, you could just fade everything out at the end. So if you want to fade everything out, you can click on the strip right here, and you can hover your mouse over the video strip and press the I key to insert a keyframe there. Then you can scrub the timeline to the very end. You can turn the opacity to 0, and then you can press the I key again to insert a keyframe. So now you can see it just fades out. And then you can do the same thing for the sound effects. So what you're going to do is go to where you want it to start to fade out. You can press the I key to insert a keyframe there on the audio. Then you can go to the very end. You can change the volume here to 0, and then you can press the I key again. And now that sound will fade out. So I'll just quickly do that for the other ones here. So adding some keyframes here, go to the end, you can turn the volume to 0, and then you can add keyframes. So now everything just fades out. So that's going to be my video editing. It's just pretty simple. So I'll now show you how to render this to a final video. So over here, we want to go down here to the output, and I'll just save it on my desktop. I'll just call it like final animation, or you can click on this button here and you can choose a place where you want to save your video to. Then here on the file format, I'm going to use the FFmpeg video, and here on the encoding, I'll use the container MPEG-4. I'll use H.264, medium quality and good, and for the audio codec, I will use AAC. So then you can save this video editing project, and then you can click on render and click on render animation. So this will wrap up this tutorial series. So if you watched the entire tutorial series, then thank you so much for watching, and I really hope you enjoyed the tutorial series, and I hope you learned a lot from the tutorial. And these free tutorials are made possible thanks to my supporters. So if you'd like to join my supporters in helping out this channel, then a great way to do that is by checking out my Gumroad store and my Patreon page, where you can get 3D models and assets, tutorial files, artwork project files, procedural materials, geometry node modifier setups, and so much more Blender content on my Gumroad and Patreon. So if you'd like to make a one-time purchase of one of my products, my Gumroad store is a great place to do that, or if you'd like to help support the channel monthly, then joining one of my Patreon memberships is a great way to do that. And you can also purchase the finished project files of this tutorial, and if you purchase the finished project files, then you'll get all the resources, and you'll get the finished Blender file and the finished animation of the tutorial. Now if you're looking for some more tutorials to watch which are somewhat related to this tutorial series, then I do have a geometry nodes tutorial playlist, and you can learn more about geometry nodes if you'd like to watch my geometry node tutorials. I also have a low poly tutorial playlist, so if you really like creating low poly artworks and low poly models, you can check out my low poly tutorial playlist where I have lots more low poly tutorials. And if you like creating nature in Blender and you want to create more nature scenes, then definitely check out my nature tutorial playlist where I have lots more nature tutorials. I'll have all the links to those playlists in the description. But thank you for watching, and I hope to see you in a future tutorial.